Dobro jutro in lepo pozdravljeni. Sem dekan fakultete za vede o zdravju iz Izole in moram odkrito povedati, da sem danes zjutraj razmišljal, kaj bi za ta uvodni nagovor današnje študentske konference povedal. Hitro sem prišel do zaključka, da ne želim še 1001. omenjati te male zverinice, ki ne ve, ali bi bila molekula, žival ali rastlina, ampak ravno nasprotno. Želim izpostaviti vas, študente, vaše mentorje, tiste študente, ki ste na današnji konferenci in z udeležbo na njej še dodatno pokazali, da veste, k čemu stremite, da imate posebne vrline usmerjenosti v kakovost, nadpovprečnost in dobro, tako strokovno kot raziskovalno delo nekateri že. To je seveda vedno plod tudi dobrega usmerjanja mentorjev, ki so, verjamem, podobnih človeških in učiteljskih vrlin. Najkakovostnejši izdelki, verjamem, da so tisti, ki so bili s strani vaših ustanov predlagani, prepoznani in bodo danes predstavljeni na tej konferenci. Se pravi, posebej na kompleksnejših področjih, kakršno je še posebej zaradi elementa dela s človekom in odgovornosti tega dela, je danes resnično pomembno, da sledite sodobnim strokovnim spoznanjem, da predstavljate odličnost stroke in hkrati, da ste tvorno kritični, torej da ste zavezani k sledenju strokovnega razvoja in prenašanja na dokazih utemeljenih spoznanj v vaše prakse in nadaljnje delo. Čeprav nisem pretirano star oziroma med kakšnimi starostami pedagoško-strokovnega dela, pa sem imel že nekaj priložnosti spoznati različna okolja, kar zadeva šole, raziskovalne sredine, strokovna združenja in podobno. Mislim, da je zelo pomembno, da se zavedamo, da je za ugled stroke in nivo stroke, to velja vsekakor tudi za strokovna področja, ki se dotikajo zdravja in zdravstva, zelo pomembno, da prispevek vsakega izmed nas, izmed vas, k temu ugledu. Zato se mi zdi pomembno, da ta konferenca in podobni dogodki predstavljajo dogodke dodatnega spletanja vezi, vzpostavljanja novih spoznanj, spoštovanja in graditve spoštovanja eden do drugega, tako na ravni posameznikov, študentov, današnjih in bodočih delavcev v stroki oziroma v zdravstvu in tudi na ravni naših šol, fakultet in drugih izobraževalnih, recimo, sredin. Mislim, da letošnji moto konference Raziskovanje za znanje, znanje za zdravje lepo strnjeno povzema precej tega, kar sem imel v mislih pri predhodnih besedah. Želim vam in želim si, da bi letošnja konferenca zaradi posebnosti izvedbe na daljavo potekala brez večjih tehničnih zapletov in da bi kljub fizični oddaljenosti uspel ta dogodek prispevati k vsebinskem povezovanju in tudi k sklepanju prijateljstev na nekoliko drugačen način. Na koncu še zahvala vsem neposredno vpletenim v pripravo na izvedbo te konference in organizacijo, tako učiteljem kot drugim vpletenim. Srečno in vse dobro in uspešno. Hvala lepa.
Spoštovane študentke in študenti, cenjeni mentorji in profesorski zbor. Vesela sem in počaščena, da vas lahko pozdravim na tokratni že 12. študentski konferenci z področja zdravstvenih ved pod imenom Raziskovanje za znanje, znanje za zdravje. Res je, da bo konferenca potekala na povsem drugačen način kot vse predhodnice, a verjamem, da ne bo zato nič manj uspešna. Predvsem ali pa prav zato, ker pravijo, da so spremembe edina stalnica v naših življenjih in vaše generacije bodo teh sprememb deležne še veliko. Moja iskrena želja je, spoštovane študentke in študenti, da je stalnica na vaši profesionalni poti tudi znanje. Računamo na vas, ker ste si izbrali najlepši, najplemenitejši poklic, usmerjen v zagotavljanje blaginje vseh nas. Vsem skupaj iskrene čestitke, uspešno delo in v imenu stanovske organizacije, zbornice, zveze, srečno vsem vam.
Spoštovane gospe in spoštovani gospodje. So stvari, ki bodo vselej močnejše od časa in daljave. Globlje od jezikov in navad, kot je slediti svojim sanjam in se spoznavati in deliti z drugimi čarobnost, ko jo odkrijemo. Pravi pisec Sergio Bambaren. Ta dan je namenjen vam. Vam, ki ste preživeli uspešna leta šolanja. V letih šolanja ste utrjevali ravno tako kot prijateljstva tudi znanje. Bogatili polnili zvezke. Vedeli ste, da vas ob zaključku šolanja čaka tudi zapis zaključnega dela. In prišel je ta dan. Dan, za katerega si najbrž želite, da bi zaradi treme minil čim hitreje, vendar dolgo trajal zaradi trenutkov, ki se vam bodo vtisnili in polepšali spomin na ta dogodek. Življenje pričnemo z malimi koraki. Mali koraki malega človeka lahko popeljejo zelo daleč. Recept, saj ne govorimo o kuhariji, ne obstaja. Drži pa, da bi kuharijo in študij lahko enačili v raznolikosti potrebnih sestavin, ki ustvarjajo celoto. Trud, ja, to bo pravi odgovor. Predanost, vztrajnost, ljubezen in veselje do dela zaokrožujejo navidezno lahek uspeh, ki za seboj skriva tiho hrepenenje po uresničitvi zastavljenih ciljev. Namen današnje 12. študentske konference z področja zdravstvenih ved z glasnim imenom in sporočilom Raziskovanje za znanje, znanje za zdravje je, da študentje širši okolici predstavijo lasten trud, ki bo izražen skozi predstavitve zaključnih del prve in druge stopnje vseh zdravstvenih fakultet in visokih šol v Sloveniji. Velikokrat pozabimo nase. Pozabimo na to, da nismo vedno imeli tega, s čimer smo danes oziroma v tem trenutku obdani. Obdani ali zapolnjeni, uspeli smo se prebiti skozi sprva skoraj nepredstavljive ovire, ki so nas samo zato, ker smo želeli, ker smo svojo trmo usmerili v doseganje ciljev in se tako prebili sprva čez belino na to skupek besed zapolnjenega lista, a ne lično urejenega osnutka zaključnega dela, ter prišli do čistine, ob kateri se je danes vredno potrepljati po rami in si reči: uspelo mi je, ponosen sem nase. Pozdravni nagovor zaključujem z razmišljanjem, ki se mi je utrnilo ob pripravi na današnji dogodek. Modrost je kot otrok, ki utira nepoznano pot. Nepoznan, kasneje pa kot dovršena idrijska čipka stan ter z znanjem in izkušnjami obdan. Svojemu srcu in razumu predan. Modrost starosti ne pozna. Prijetno poslušanje vam želim, Katarina Adamič. Prav tako naj trenutek izkoristim ter vas vljudno povabim k poslušanju predavanja avtorja in profesorja Stefanosa Mandzukas z naslovom Ugotovitve kvalitativnih raziskav kot vir na dokazih temelječe prakse.
Hello and welcome to this year's annual conference. My name is Stefanos Mandzukas. I'm an associate professor in nursing at the University of Ioannina in Greece. It is with great pleasure that I'm invited to be this year's keynote speaker, and I must express my gratitude to the University of Primorska and the Faculty of Health Sciences and all its members for organizing the conference and also for inviting me to be a part of this conference. Lastly, I would like to express my gratitude to all the conference members, and I hope you enjoy my presentation as well as all other conference proceedings. My presentation will focus today on qualitative research findings as a valid source of evidence for practice. This is for me an important issue because I'm both a qualitative researcher and I'm also quite interested in keen writer and author on evidence-based practice. So the fundamental question that we will try to answer in this presentation is how and why qualitative research findings are or can be a valid source for evidence and for evidence-based practice. The aim of this presentation is to provide an understanding of qualitative research and the role of qualitative evidence as a valid source for evidence for practice. The objectives of the presentation are for the participants at the end to be able to analyze the researchers' presence in qualitative studies, to define valid qualitative studies for evidence-based practice, and to address the issue of bias in qualitative studies and its effect on evidence construction and evidence use. I will start with some basic definitions on qualitative research and what are the key aspects of qualitative research. The aim of any qualitative research is not to examine the phenomena themselves as isolated events. In other words, events are always contextual and related to other people that are within that context. So events, human experiences, feelings, and perceptions are not irrelevant of where they take place and who else is at that place. Also, the aim of qualitative research is to add something more to the participants' words for it to be considered research contribution, whether it be synthesis, interpretation, or development of concepts. In other words, when we interview people in qualitative research or observe behaviors, we do it not just to capture their own words, but to make sense of those words or those actions. So that requires some form of interpretation, some form of analysis, or some form of synthesis done by the researcher. Finally, the aims of qualitative research is that the researcher themselves constitute through their interpretive practices the very world they study. In other words, the researcher in qualitative studies is the key person. Without the researcher, in qualitative studies, there is no research. And there are no findings because findings need to be interpreted, need to be understood, need to make sense of them. It's not just capturing them, it is about making sense of them. What do those actions or those words of the participants tell us? Therefore, the researcher becomes a central person in qualitative study because the data does not speak on its own. It is the researcher that makes the data speak, and the data speaks only through the researcher. Someone has to tell the story, and that someone is unavoidably the researcher. The researcher needs to interpret the findings. The researcher constructs the research world. The end conclusion of this logical argument is that the researcher constructs the research world. The research world is not just out there, but the research world is constructed by the researcher. In other words, the researcher's sense making of the world is what is the outcome of any qualitative research. It's not what is out there, it is what sense we make of what is out there. The traditional view of qualitative methods, which has been influenced primarily from quantitative methods, from quantitative studies, is that the researcher should either put in brackets, like mathematical brackets, previous concepts to avoid contaminating the findings with the researcher biases, or the researcher acquires a stranger's stance. It is like being a stranger without knowing the context, or a fly on the wall. No one observes or is influenced by the researcher, hence neutralizing the researcher's presence, or provides thick descriptions or extensive original codes as a kind of proof that the researcher was actually there in the research setting rather than making up the story. So traditional qualitative methods, which were highly influenced by quantitative research methodologies, required that the researcher puts in brackets their own biases, their own preconceptions, their own understandings of the context of the people they interview or observe and the study they are conducting. And also, it was required that they became a stranger, like if they didn't have any understanding of the context. And also, they became like a fly on the wall. No one realized that they were present. And also, they wrote up their narratives and their findings of their studies as long texts that had long quotations or thick descriptions of what was taking place in order to prove that they are not making up the story, but they are actually there. My question is, should the researcher disappear from the research context? According to traditional qualitative researchers and quantitative researchers, the answer is emphatically yes. The researcher should disappear from the study. They argue for converting the other into the same and treating the I as it. In other words, it's like the individual is the same as all individuals. And myself, the I, is like the other. We are the same thing. Hence suggesting that diversity and individuality can be merged into the uniformity of sameness, and therefore biases can be ruled out by viewing individual and subjective bias as generic biases, not characteristic of the individual researcher, but rather as biases that every researcher has and which therefore can cancel themselves out due to the fact that all individuals share the same generic individuality. This is the notion that essentially our individuality is a common thing, and essentially it's not an individuality, it's something that we share all us as individuals and as humans, and therefore there's no point of making apparent this individuality, and therefore by just ruling it out is that we're doing the best service as possible for qualitative research. But there's a problem. If we accept that the researcher should and can disappear from the research context and the research study, then we negate our original preposition and what we have already accepted, that the researcher is the central person in qualitative studies. In other words, if we accept that, then any person can do the same qualitative study and come up with the same qualitative results, which in fact is not the case. Each qualitative researcher unavoidably comes up with their own results. And what qualitative researchers talk about is not about generalizing the findings, but about transferring the results into different contexts. So it is about transferring the results in order to inspire, influence, and impact on the thinking of another qualitative researcher that will conduct another study in another context, essentially not to produce the same results, but to produce similar or comparable results. So the problem becomes, how can, on one hand, we claim that qualitative researchers are the central person in the qualitative study, and on the other hand, accept that all individuals have a generic individuality that can impact in the same manner upon a study. those two concepts contradict each other and don't hold ground. The next question is, do we care? My answer is yes, we care, because such contradictions define any study's validity or not. It is a matter of validity. If a research study, either qualitative or quantitative, contradicts itself, unavoidably it lacks validity. Good and valid studies have no contradictions in them or minimize any potential contradictions. In other words, the validity of a study's finding is not judged by the results or the findings section. So it's not about what we write in the findings section or in the discussion section. The way we judge the validity of the study is the process, not the product. So therefore, the validity of a study is judged on the premise that the researcher presents an explicit audit trail of all steps followed to reach the specific results. And most importantly, that each step is fully justified and follows logically from the previous steps and leads logically to the next step without contradictions. Hence, any contradictions in decisions or steps followed in the research process has a direct effect on the study's validity. So in simple terms, any study, and in specific qualitative studies in this case, need to avoid contradictions. In other words, they need to avoid to say one thing and do another, or to say that they believe in one thing and at the end do something else. And in our case, if we say that the researcher is a central person, is a specific individual, the most important person in carrying out the study, then we cannot say this person doesn't matter and therefore can exclude their biases, because everyone would have the same biases because anyone can do the same study. This is contradiction. This is contradiction of processes. And therefore, whatever the outcome would be, whatever the product of the research, it will be invalid. Valid outcomes require avoiding contradictions in the process of doing the study. So who decides if there are contradictions in the research process? Any contradictions in the research process are ruled against the epistemological position that the researcher has asserted at the beginning of the study, and this is referred to as the epistemological position of the researcher. In other words, the researcher at the beginning of the study defines his or her epistemological position, and I will explain what that implies in just a bit later on. And this is what defines how she or he will do the study. And if he or she actually does it in this way, then there are no contradictions, and therefore the study is valid. If the researcher states a specific epistemological position, but does something different, then there are contradictions, and therefore the study outcomes are invalid, irrelevant of what they are. They might sound the best research results possible. Nonetheless, they will remain invalid because they're produced as a result of a contradiction. The term epistemology refers to the researcher's belief in the form and nature of reality, truth, and knowledge. In other words, epistemology is what the researcher believes about the nature of reality, truth, and knowledge. What is truth? What is knowledge? And how we can capture or develop this knowledge and this truth about nature and reality. The researcher's epistemological position conceptualizes the means and production of knowledge and the relationship that exists between the knower and the would-be knower. In simple terms, again, the epistemological position provides the researcher and also the reader of what were the means, the mechanisms for the researcher to produce the knowledge, and what the researcher thinks the relationship between the participant and the interviewee or participantee in the study is. Let me try to make this notion of epistemology a bit simpler, because essentially it is big words that sometimes complicate and make things much more complex than what they really are. In other words, the researcher's epistemological position defines the rules by which the researcher agrees to abide by as to produce knowledge. So in very simple terms, it is the rules of the game, of the research game. The epistemological position of the researcher are the rules of the research game. So like there are different rules for different games, for football, basketball, baseball, etc. There are different rules for producing different types of knowledge from the research process. There are different epistemologists with different rules, as there are different games with different rules as well. This doesn't imply that one game is better than the other, but they're just different rules. So just like football is a game that the main rule is that you don't touch the ball with your hands, basketball is a game that the main rule is that you don't touch the ball with your feet. Both of these games are valid, football and basketball, and excellent players in each game follow the rules as best as possible of their game. In the case that a player of football decides to follow the rules of basketball, i.e., play football by touching the ball only with the hands, she or he will be the worst player of football. Inversely, the same will apply to a basketball player that decides to play football by touching the ball just with their hands. Therefore, a good player is judged against the rules of the game he decides to abide by. In simple words, the game of football is not a better game from basketball or baseball or tennis, etc. It is played by different rules. And good players for each of these games play by the rules of the game. If they don't follow the rules, they become bad players. Or if they use the rules from a different game, again, they become bad players. The same thing quite applies to research as well, where epistemology, as I just explained, are the rules of the game. How we define reality, how we create knowledge, and how we define our relationship with our participants. If someone says, I will play the research game with the rules, with epistemology of qualitative studies, and then goes on to play the game according to quantitative epistemology rules, then this will be poor, bad, qualitative research. Similarly, a good researcher is judged as good when she or he follows the rules of his or her chosen epistemology, the rules that guide his or her research. So for positivist epistemology, the rules is that they are objective facts, an absolute truth, a foundational reality out there, and some general and unchangeable laws of nature or society awaiting to be discovered. These exist independent of human reality and are free from temporal and contextual factors. Let me just explain this. There are different epistemologies, i.e., different rules of how we produce knowledge. One of the main epistemologies of producing knowledge and conducting research is the positivist epistemology. And the positivist epistemology is what we would define as that of physics, of mathematics, where they accept that there are objective facts, i.e., gravitational force of the Earth. There are absolute truths, i.e., that the Earth rotates around the sun. There's a foundational reality that, for instance, oxygen and hydrogen creates water, and some general and unchangeable laws of nature or society, i.e., that the human body requires oxygen to stay alive. Those are out there, and what is expected from human beings in order to create knowledge is to discover those realities. We did not know that there was gravitational force. We did not know why we were gravitating towards the Earth and not floating in space until Newton defined that the reason this happens is because there's a gravitational force, because the Earth rotates around the sun, etc. So for the positivist epistemology, knowledge is out there, and the cosmos works like a clock, like a machine. And what humans can do in order to create the knowledge is to discover how the cosmos works as a clock, and therefore put that down into laws, write it down into rules and regulations and way things function. That is what is knowledge, and therefore that requires some high degrees of objectivity, mathematical objectivity. Therefore, in this case, the researcher must explicitly separate his or her biases from objective facts and acquire a God's eye view on the phenomena under study that would lead to the revelation of objective truth about them. In other words, in order to discover these realities that are out there, i.e., the reason we don't float in space and instead we gravitate towards the Earth and we're able to walk on the Earth rather than float is because there's gravitational force because the Earth goes around the sun. Newton, in order to do this, took out his own beliefs as a religious person that the Earth is flat and that the sun actually goes around the Earth. He said that, I'll take out my beliefs, my religious beliefs about this, was a highly religious paradigm, and said, in order to do this, I'll ignore my beliefs and try to see the facts, how things work. And that is what he did. And that is why they say in the positivist epistemology that the rule of the game is to avoid your personal perceptions, i.e., your superstitions, your religious beliefs, or even your common sense, and follow where the facts take you. So if a researcher agrees that the positivist epistemological rules are ones she or he will follow, then the original premise that the researcher is a central person in qualitative studies cannot hold. If we go now into qualitative studies, that we try to identify human experiences, how it feels to be in a situation, how it feels to be in pain, how it feels to be sick, how it feels to be empowered, how it feels to be treated in a specific manner. These are not rules or nature's laws of how we feel. It is very individualistic. Also, the way we ask our question and the way we make sense of what that person is saying or why or she is saying it or doing in a specific manner, it is an interpretation done by the researcher. And again, it is a specific researcher that makes an interpretation. So the specific researcher cannot abandon their own preconceptions, their own ideas, even their own superstitions in that sense. They need to expose them. They need to say why they have come to this conclusion, but they are coming to a conclusion. So if a qualitative researcher follows like positivist epistemological rules, then she or he considers that there are objective facts, absolute truths, and there's a general and unchangeable laws of nature or society that is of importance and are the central idea. And the researcher needs to disappear from the study. This is the view of quantitative research and of some traditional understandings of qualitative research, especially in the early days of qualitative research, that essentially qualitative research mimicked quantitative research. But there's a problem here. There's an epistemological contradiction. It's like playing football with the rules of basketball. Because qualitative researchers say we try to identify the unique experiences of the individual and try to make sense of those individual experiences. But how can you make sense of them if you're saying they are objective and if they're unchangeable and they're part of nature's laws? It cannot happen. The rules of non-positivistic epistemologies, in other words, those epistemologies that do not conform to the positivist ideal of objectivity and generalizability, denounce the possibility of an absolute truth, of a definitive reality, and of the omnipotence of meta-narratives or the authoritarian power of certain narratives in explaining the world. The non-positivist epistemologists maintain an anti-foundationalist perspective, wherein reality takes the form of multiple and intangible mental constructions. These constructions are either produced by the individual mind or shaped over time by social, political, cultural, economic, ethnic, and gender factors. Furthermore, each construction is considered not to be more or less true in any absolute sense, but simply to be more or less informed and or sophisticated. In simple terms, non-positivist epistemologists argue that there are no absolute truths. There's no absolute truth how you should feel when you're in pain. There's no definitive reality. There's no definitive reality how it is to be a first-year student. There is no narrative that can explain everything, i.e. just one theory that explains everything in the world. And therefore, every time theories are produced, and then new theories are produced to overthrow previous theories we had. To put it in simple terms, researchers that adhere to non-positive epistemology do not study how we gravitate towards the Earth and don't float, but why we feel in a specific way while we are on Earth. it answers essentially different types of questions. Important questions produces different types of knowledge, but that knowledge is produced by a different set of rules. And these rules say and assert that there is not a unique truth, an absolute truth. There is not a definitive reality. The way we feel, each person feels, is not identical with how each other person feels. There may be similarities. We may have compassion. We may empathize, but we cannot feel exactly the same way a specific individual feels, and therefore each individual reacts or acts in very specific ways. In simple terms, for non-positivists, the epistemological rules are that there is nothing to discover, so there is no discovery, no reality out there to discover, but what we can do is to create or construct small narratives, small stories, explaining, elucidating, understanding, and possibly changing individuals' life experiences. For example, it is not if the sun is out there as a celestial body. This, for qualitative researchers, seems of secondary importance. But the primary issue is how each individual feels about the sun. For example, when I was in London, I had a house, which was a very beautiful house, and the bedroom of the house, one of the walls was glass. It was a glass wall, and it took me outside in the backyard. It was great. It had an excellent view. I was very impressed when I rented the house. It was excellent. The only problem for me was that that glass wall was facing the sunrise. So every morning around 5 o'clock, 5:30, 6 o'clock, the sun would rise, and that would wake me up. And I bought curtains, I bought different types of shades. Nonetheless, the sun would wake me up every morning, and I never had a nice day's sleep in that house. Eventually, after 6 months, I left the house when my contract was over. The reason why? Because the sun was waking me up. So for me, it was not a matter if the sun was rising or not. But the problem was for me, the issue was for me, how it felt when the sun rose. And I'm a person that works late at night and likes to sleep a bit late in the morning as well. That was a problem for me. The sun was a problem. Obviously, the sun was not a problem for other people, but it was for me. So it is how it felt. And it is these small stories, the way we feel about things and the way we experience them, that are of importance in qualitative studies. So these small narrative constructs are not out there. They don't exist independently of humans, but are the product of the human mind, the researcher's mind. In other words, if a researcher interviewed me at that point and asked me how it feels to see the sunrise, I would be expressing my frustration about the strong sunrise. My experience would be very negative. I would feel because that made me very tired, irritated, unable to work, and had to sleep at other times in the day, which interfered with my schedules. So that reality would be a constructed reality. The researcher would construct a reality saying that the sunrise might be useful for some people, some other people might be delighted to see the sunrise, but there might be people that might affect their work, their productivity, and their sense of well-being. So that is a construction, a narrative, a story that is constructed about the realities, multiple realities of an individual, not a singular reality, but multiple realities of the individual. And this is a key phrase for me. Keeping an open mind should not be equated with having an empty head. In other words, to have an open mind as a researcher and think there are different possibilities, it's not the same thing to say I must empty my head from all my knowledge or my experiences, all the things I know. In order for the researcher to construct such stories or narratives, she or he needs to have the tools to be able to interpret, understand, and empathize with the participants. In other words, in order to make sense of what the participant is saying or doing, the researcher needs to have some understanding of what is happening, of what it feels to be in a specific case or area or context. If the researcher discards his or her biases, previous experiences, preconceptions, etc., then she or he suspends all knowledge claims and language representations that would provide the capacity to name the world. In other words, if I go into a biology lab, which I have no understanding or even I don't even have the words to express what is happening in there, how can I make sense of what is happening? And even if that makes sense, how can I use the appropriate words to transfer my understandings of what is happening into the text? So in other words, how can I make the context into text if I don't have the words? Therefore, I need to have those words. I need to have those experiences. I need to have some form of understanding what is happening with in that lab. Similar with nursing. If you don't have the words as a nurse to explain what is happening or what is taking place here, it is very difficult to transfer what is taking place. And there's a grave possibility that you might heavily misinterpret things. In other words, the researcher without biases will not have the words and language to construct small narratives, small stories. The researcher without previous preconceptions and biases will not have the tools to construct the narratives. Hence, the rules of the game for non-positivist epistemologists require that the researcher's bias and position are necessary elements and need to be obvious and always present in the study. Not following the rules of the game for non-positivist epistemologists is to be a poor player, a poor researcher. So to conclude this part regarding qualitative research is that bias is not by definition negative. Let me say this again. Bias is not by definition negative or a limitation or something that needs to be extricated. It depends on the researcher's epistemology if it should be included or not. If we're using positivist epistemology, we need to eliminate bias. If we're using non-positivist epistemology, i.e. qualitative research, we need to include our biases into our studies. The validity of any study is based not on some predefined all-inclusive criteria, but if the researcher is faithful to the epistemological rules that she or he has decided to follow at the beginning of the study. For non-positivist qualitative studies, the rule is researcher's position and biases needs to be part of the study and be visible to the reader. However, this position and bias of qualitative studies has in part become problematic in the evidence-based era of practice. The reason for this is that from the very beginning of conceptualizing evidence-based practice, the idea was based on positivist epistemology rather than inclusion of different epistemologies, i.e. it's like saying that the only game worthwhile playing is football. Any other game we should exclude. So no basketball in the Olympics, no football, no tennis, no baseball, no long jumping, etc. So just one game. And that is very restrictive in the production of knowledge. Allow me to make this more clear by starting with a history of evidence-based practice. It was called evidence-based medicine then. It was essentially in 1992, a group of prominent professors wrote an article entitled Evidence-Based Medicine, a New Approach to Teaching the Practice of Medicine. This article in the history of evidence-based practice is considered to be the manifesto, the starting point that ushers the new age of evidence-based practice and introduces not only a new way of teaching medicine, but also a new way of practicing medicine. Consequently, different sciences like nursing, etc., have adapted those key ideas, and therefore it is not anymore evidence-based medicine, it is evidence-based practice. In any case, evidences as conceptualized by this article are the results that can best achieve objective and absolute truths that can be generalized and implemented in all cases or in all instances. So this is a very positivistic point of view. It is based on this article is based on the positivist epistemology, that there are objective realities out there, there are absolute truths that we can find, discover them, and generalize them to all cases, all incidences, all individuals. And this has led to what they defined as the hierarchy of evidence, where at the top of the hierarchy were randomized controlled double-blinded studies, then there were randomized controlled studies, then cohort studies, and qualitative studies were somewhere here. So it was by definition that some studies were better or more valid than others. This position, which is possibly the most widely held position, asserts that the evidence are the result of research findings, and in specific of research findings extracted from randomized controlled trials, what they call as RCTs. The basic characteristic of RCTs is that they conduct an experiment, a trial. That is why they're called trials. in an objective and unbiased manner. More specific, the experiment consists of two groups with the same characteristics and problems, where one group, Group A, is administered or provided with a new drug or therapy or procedure, and the second group, Group B, is not provided with this new medicine or this new procedure. It's given a placebo or treated with the old procedure, and with an overall aim to compare and measure if the new therapy or drug or procedure produces any difference between Group A and B. If it does produce a difference, it implies that it works better. If it doesn't, that implies it doesn't work better. If it produces worse results, it implies that it's worse than what our current drug, medication, or procedures provide. These are called randomized controlled trials because there's an experiment, there's a trial, where the researcher controls which group gets the new therapy or drug or procedure and which group does not. But the distribution of people in each group who gets into each group is done randomly. Also, these are done blindly, so neither the researcher knows which person gets which therapy, nor the participant knows if she or he is getting the new therapy. This is called double-blinded because both researcher and participant do not know which therapy is given or if they are given a therapy. The underlying philosophical assumption of this conception of evidence-based practice is that human characteristics and problems can be measured, and the results of such experimentation and measurement can be generalized. Everyone will have the same results if they are put in the same conditions. And the clinical problems, therefore, have absolute or right answers. So there's a single right answer for all clinical problems. This position essentially dovetails, fits well with the positive philosophy that was the dominant method of research and way of understanding the world in the 20th century for research, whereby the main aim was to discover absolute truths and reveal reality. Such research studies have experiments that follow objective rules and require the extrication of subjectivity in order to avoid corroding the objective facts and the absolute truths of the research findings. So essentially, this concept of evidence-based practice requires that the experiment is done in a way that follows objective rules, and therefore subjectivity, individual biases need to be eradicated, because otherwise the objectivity would be eroded. And while this position may have degrees of logic and produce valid types of knowledge, nonetheless, by saying that this is the only way of producing knowledge, has limitations. The limitation of this position on evidence construction is that it assumes that there are just one set of rules in judging research evidence. The rules of objectivity, measurement, generalizability, and eradication of the researchers from the research process. This is a problem for evidence-based practice because it ignores all the other games, all the other types of knowledge production in the research playing field, i.e. ignores all other sources of evidence. This, for a movement like evidence-based practice that asserts to be based on rationality, makes no sense. Evidence-based practice movement was based on the notion of making rational arguments and providing facts, evidence for those rational arguments. In other words, fundamental to evidence-based practice is the notion that there is an inherent rationality in the way we argue and make decisions. And in order to make those decisions and arguments, we need to produce facts. We need to produce evidence. And it makes no logic. It's not rational to ignore the fact that individuals have realities, that there's not a singular reality out there. Yes, obviously the sun rises every morning, but the way each individual feels about this reality is very different. And to ignore that people may feel and experience in different ways, for instance, the sunrise, is to ignore significant parts of knowledge. And that is irrational. Further limitations for the positivist perspective of evidence-based practice is that clinicians do not have the time or the resources or the potential each time they are required to make a decision to go to the library or the internet and search electronic databases to find RCTs to justify their decisions. So even if we accept that objective, absolute truths and reality that needs to be discovered in the positivistic manner through randomized control trials are the only and best sources of evidence, it is problematic because as clinicians, we cannot stop our actions when we are caring for people or we're in an emergency situation to go into the library and search to find the best and more appropriate randomized controlled trials in order to deal with our situation. So there's a technicality there, there's a practicality there that's not feasible. Secondly, this position transforms clinicians to mere technicians that simply find the research findings from RCTs and implement them without any critical faculties required. In other words, the practitioner, the clinician, disappears, has no judgment. What he or she does is merely implementing what the results of research findings from randomized controlled trials are saying. It is like a technician, or it's like making a cake. So it's 2 spoons of sugar, 2 spoons of cake, 2 spoons of butter, 2 spoons of flour, and you make your cake. But it doesn't work for each individual, because each individual have unique characteristics, have other unique situations and contexts that influence the way they behave or the way they react to their elements, to the elements, or to an element, to an illness. Lastly, daily practice is complex, uncertain, contextual, and practitioners rely on more than one type of knowledge, which RCTs are unable to accommodate. In daily practice, there are manifold variables of the practice environment that cannot be controlled, and practitioners cannot be objective because the kernel of practice is human interactions and understanding of the subjective perceptions. So again, by interacting with our clients, with our patients, with our people we care for, we develop understandings that are unique about these individuals and about their context and about other people that relate to them. So again, just relying to just one type of knowledge does not answer the complexity of these interrelationships that exist within the context of everyday reality. Therefore, implementing objective findings as written in the findings of RCTs does not make sense, because daily practice does not have absolute truths and objective answers. In other words, our daily practice is not conducive to just single answers. There are multiple answers, and sometimes there are shades of the same answer that provides solutions to people's problems. Also, daily clinical problems require the interpretations of the clinician as to decide if the specific patient they are caring for have the same characteristics as those in the trials in order to implement the findings of the trials. But this unavoidably inserts subjectivism and invalidates this notion of objectivity in RCTs. In other words, even if we accept that the reality out there is singular and every person feels the same way, and in irrelevant of context, they would behave in the same way if we implement the findings whether we have from randomized controlled trials. The problem is that someone has to decide that this person fits in with a specific randomized controlled trial, because there are different randomized controlled trials. So the clinician has to make a decision, which is a specific decision, which is an individual decision that the clinician has to make, and say this person fits into this randomized controlled trial. But that, by definition, inserts subjectivity, the subjectivity of the practitioner, of the clinician. Hence, the critique concludes that RCTs are not the only type of evidence available, and RCTs are not, by definition, the best available evidence. So we come to the conclusion that evidence from randomized controlled trials are just one source of evidence, one source of valid evidence that requires objectivity, that requires to be generalized, but we need to acknowledge that there are limitations for this as well. We need to acknowledge that these evidence are not, by definition, the best evidence, because they might not be suitable, and because they have limitations. Because even if we accept the rules of the game, because the rules of the game is that they should be objective and generalizable, nonetheless, we know that there is an inherent problem in these rules, because, as we said, the clinician unavoidably has to use their subjective judgment. And also, it is highly unlikely that it will answer all our questions of how to care and treat the individual in their specific context, and how they interact with other people within that context, and how they interact with the carers and the practitioners, and how they feel about their lifestyle and the way of living. This position on EBP and evidence-based practice essentially argues that evidences are the product of synthesis of multiple knowledge sources, and this includes results from research irrelevant of research methodology, i.e. randomized controlled trials, quantitative studies, surveys, qualitative studies, focus groups, etc., of what are the practitioners or the clinicians' experiences and their own wisdom, and the preferences of the individual or their family members. For this to be achieved, the practitioner needs to document the multiple and unique sources of each patient, consciously assess the planning of a unique approach to this unique individual that requires caring, and make a value judgment which sources are better or should have precedence in each case and act upon them. Essentially, it requires that the practitioner uses reflection and becomes a reflective practitioner in creating evidences. In order for practitioners or students to use reflection in order to assess at an individual basis each source of evidence, they need to understand the epistemologies, the rules of the game that each research study is based upon. For qualitative research based on non-positivist epistemologies, bias is not something that needs to be or can be eliminated. On the contrary, the researcher's bias should become part of the research. To suggest otherwise is to invalidate the study due to emerging contradictions between the purported theoretical framework and the conduct of the study. Therefore, evidence from research should not be lightheartedly excluded as valid or invalid due to potential biases of the researcher. But the bias issue should be assessed based on the epistemology the researcher followed. Concluding this presentation, and in simple words, my argument is don't exclude evidence as invalid, term them invalid, and therefore excluding them as evidence, because you assume that there is some bias in the study. In order to identify if the study is valid and should be used as evidence for practice, you need to identify the rules of the game, the epistemology that the researcher said that he or she will use. If she or he is using a non-positivist epistemology and using qualitative studies, then she or he needs to include bias, because bias is essential in interpreting and having the language to create meaning of the participants' world, and therefore creating and constructing the narratives, the stories, the qualitative experiences of other people and participants in the study. If the study is based on positivist epistemology, then bias should be excluded and therefore should not be there in the study. And the researcher should be explicit how he or she excluded her biases. So my final point is that when reading evidence, when reading studies, in order to identify their useful evidence, you need to assess bias based on the rules of the game, based on the epistemologies, based on if the researcher is using a positivist or non-positivist epistemology. If the researcher is not stating their epistemology, then this can be a problem. And this then can be poor possible evidence. But not by definition studies that use qualitative methods that include researcher biases to be excluded as invalid evidence. At this point, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for taking part in this conference and for viewing my presentation. Unfortunately, this has been recorded, and therefore there's no possibility for Q&As, for questions and answers. But I hope I was lucid and explicit enough to make sense and to be useful to you and to your studies. Please allow me to thank once more the University of Primorska and the Faculty of Human Sciences, everyone that works there, for inviting me to be a keynote speaker. And thank you for everyone that participated and watched my presentation. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Vabim vas k udeležbi in poslušanju posameznih sekcij.